Marxism and Other Western Fallacies. An Islamic Critique by Ali Shari'ati. This is a Pliskin audiobook production. Humanity between Marxism and religion. It is certainly difficult these days to speak of religion. The modern mind can hardly accept it as a progressive, liberating force. What, we must ask ourselves, is this modern mind? Where did it take shape and acquire such an attitude? It comes from the West, just like the other products and manifestations of the modern life and civilization upon which the West has left its mark. But today, in the intellectual milieu of the East, when the West is mentioned, the word brings to mind only capitalism, industrialism, Christianity, colonialism, bourgeois liberalism. When the intention is to deny the West, to resist it, Marxism is considered the most effective weapon against it. Whereas it is seldom realized that Marxism itself is utterly a product of the history, social organization, and culture outlook of this same West. This is not simply because its founders and leading figures are all Western, but rather, to employ a Marxist analysis, the ideology itself must be accounted a mere superstructure resting on the social infrastructure of the bourgeois industrial system of production in the modern West. Marxism dogmatically divides society into two parts: infrastructure and superstructure. It equates the former with the mode of production, which is determined in accordance with the nature of the means of production. The form of the superstructure, which comprises religion, morals, literature, arts, psychology, philosophy, political, social, economic, humanistic, and existential thought and belief, and so forth, to every shade of ideology, then arises from the means of production. Given this a priori principle and method of perception, who could doubt that, for capitalism and Marxism alike, the means of production have been the same? It is also appropriate to mention here that, for Protestantism and for fascism, the means of production have also been the same. Protestantism, capitalism, Marxism, and fascism. These four are brothers born of the same materialism and raised in the same household, the West, although they have followed four different careers. Protestantism is a religion, but one that turned from love to power. From Christianity, it has forged an ideology and morality compatible with bourgeois life. Capitalism advertised as its official ideology the liberalism and democracy based on the 17th century materialism of the encyclopedists and assembled from concepts of freedom and human dignity in philosophy and science, an ideology amenable to the new bourgeoisie. Marxism, with its economic rationale for all manifestations of human existence, for human life and history, turned socialism into a purely economic order based on material abundance through industry, and forged from Hegel's dialectic, which found God realized in human history, the means to realize a bourgeois life for the proletariat. Fascism, arising in the same social setting as Marxism, was basically movements of the technocrats and bureaucrats who, between the two focal points of power, capital and labor, lacked the least foothold and were mere pawns of these forces. Thus they sought power and rule. Fascism mobilized large numbers from among the middle classes. What is held in common by these four movements? One, a religion; another, an economic system; the third, a revolutionary class ideology; and the last, a virulent racism. All four favor: 1. The dismissal or categorical denial of any immaterial spiritual dimension in man. Banishment of the notion of man as a being having a supra-material essence, as an inherently idealistic being. 2. The confinement of human needs and ideals to the narrow limits of material consumption and power, and the triumph of economic needs over all others. 3. The gravitation of philosophy, or at any rate morals and psychology, toward materialism. 4. Reliance upon the machine as the sole guarantee of economic power and consumption. Worship of production and, in consequence, assumption by the machine of the role of idol of the new civilization. 5. Inevitably, a confrontation with religious faith, or the spiritual dimension of religion, which is considered the most powerful obstacle and source of resistance to these movements. Protestantism, formerly a reformist movement, within the framework of Christianity in favor of the new bourgeois class, remained within the confines of that class and was unable to become a worldwide intellectual movement. Then, more recently, in the fossilized society of the West, the existential philosophy, which once showed itself to be a vital movement and summons, has been abandoned. Fascism declined as swiftly as it was born. Anyway, it is essentially a specific ideological school that amounts to nothing in relation to the scope of world history we are examining here. Capitalism, in the first place, has changed greatly since the 19th century, and in the second, does not constitute a systematic ideological school, but rather an economic and social order, which confronts religion only indirectly. That is, anti-religious thinkers combat religion in the name of science, not in the name of capitalism and the bourgeoisie, although such thinkers were nurtured and raised by that social organization, and the science upon which they lean is infused with the new bourgeois spirit. As for Marxism, however, 1. Because it has a global mission with no particular religious, cultural, or national confines. 2. Because it is a comprehensive, well-defined ideology, committed to the ardent defense of solidly crystallized dogmas. 3. Because it not only sets forth a particular economic or political system, but also intrudes into every area, every dimension of the private and social existence of man, material, spiritual, intellectual, and moral. 4. Because it possesses a philosophical and creedal foundation upon which it bases all of its analyses of and solutions for every question of man and society, past and future. 5. Because its foundation, dialectical materialism, bears such a clear and undeniable resemblance to the most virulent forms of religious fanaticism. 6. Because dialectical materialism, according to the Marxists, is not merely a philosophical perspective like those of the secular materialists and naturalists of ancient Greece or the 18th century, which conveyed only a certain philosophical abstraction of man and the universe, but rather is both the only completely scientific description of reality and a fanatically pursued mission, incapable of tolerating any other perspective alongside it. 7. Because it accounts itself the absolute and exclusive truth, beside which there can be only absolute falsity. For these reasons, with all the fervor of a prophetic mission, Marxism sees its task as the systematic eradication of all forms of religion. Since it basically considers religion something not only futile but intellectually damaging, it sees it as an enemy of the people, an obstacle in its path, and it never attempts to conceal the frank words of Lenin: "One must treat religion ruthlessly." For the philosophical basis of Marxism's anti-religious outlook, we must look to the words of the intellectual that Marxists regard as belonging to the new bourgeoisie. Thus, Marx, and following him, Lenin advised that communists republish all the works of the encyclopedists and Feuerbach. The latter is the connecting link between Hegel's idealism and Marx's dialectical materialism. He is responsible for that overturning of the Hegelian pyramid that Marx and Engels claim to have originated, and many of his discussions are to be found uncredited among the pages of their works. He offered an interpretation of religion to which Marx and his followers have added nothing but detail and commentary, or mere repetition. The well-known charge laid against that turns on the alienating affect of religion, proclaimed as a great Marxist discovery, is essentially Feuerbach's. In his book, The Essence of Christianity, he executed the famous inversion wrought upon the school of Hegel in connection with the relation between the Son, Christ, and the Father, God. He says, "In this instance, it is the Father who is born of the Son. God does not manifest Christ. Christ manifests God, and the Christ who becomes God is himself the outward realization of the human spirit, the spirit of mankind, urgently seeking deliverance. The Holy Spirit is none other than that human spirit which, failing to recognize Godhood within itself, personifies it in a metaphysical being and situates what is within itself in an imagined heaven." This is what he means by the alienating effect of religion. If one can avoid this alienation, one will arrive at oneself, experiencing the self-awareness of homo homini deo, man who is his own God. Marx was the son of a Jew who, because of the legal restrictions on daily life for the Jews in Germany, had converted to Protestantism. While a young Hegelian, Marx wrote in the preface to a treatise, "Philosophy is allied with the faith of Prometheus. In sum, I feel a loathing toward the gods. All the proofs of God's existence prove rather his non-existence. The real proofs should have the opposite character. Because nature lacks a right order, God exists. Because an unintelligible world exists, God exists. In other words, irrationality is the basis for God's existence." Who is Prometheus? In Greek mythology, he is one of the gods who, in order to render a service to man, betrayed the other gods. One night, as all the gods slept, he stole the divine fire and handed it over to man. When the other gods came to know of this, they bound him in chains. They were alarmed that humanity should possess the celestial fire, for they wanted people to remain forever in near that of the angels. Marx, who had taken up the Promethean faith and the idea of a Promethean society from the humanistic sociologists, and who was to be influenced by Saint-Simon and later by Proudhon, has in this instance inherited the religious outlook of Greek mythology, just as they did. He has generalized from the God-man relationship in Greek religion to that in all religions, unaware that the outlook of the great Eastern religions is completely contrary to it. They envision a God very sympathetic toward humanity, not one, as in the Greek religion, who regards man as a rival and faces him with jealousy and malevolence, only to be met with fear. The religious message of the East is based on the raising of man from earth to heaven, from the ranks of the corporeal and bestial to the angelic or divine. In the religion of Zoroaster, humans fight side by side with the Amshaspans for the victory of Ahura Mazda. These supernatural beings are always the patrons of man. In Manichaean dualism, it is through man that divine light is realized in existence. In Chinese and Indian mysticism, essentially, there exists no impassable barrier between man and God. Rather, God flows through man and even nature as the spirit of being and the essence of the real. Most importantly, that divine fire has entered the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions, which share a common worldview, in the form of the forbidden tree, with Prometheus becoming Satan, while it is God who is man's real Prometheus. When Marx declares, "I feel a loathing toward the gods," we should reflect on his choice of wording in the preface to a philosophical treatise, indeed, one discussing the gods. The choice of the word loathing is not a natural one. It expresses an emotion, not a philosophical or scientific point. One must search for the roots of such a reaction in Marx's private life, in the disappointment in love the priests caused him. Let us look at the rest of his comment. The real proofs should have the opposite character. Because nature lacks a right order, God exists. Because an unintelligible world exists, God exists. In other words, irrationality is the basis for God's existence. It exhibits a kind of confused logic in that it has taken the view of popular religion as the criterion of religious reasoning, whereas the popular religious approach always seeks God outside natural, rational laws, in unintelligible courses of events. It sees proofs of his existence in extraordinary occurrences and in unscientific and unnatural sources. By contrast, the scriptures, and particularly the Quran, have made a rational case for Tawhid on the basis of nature, custom, the constant laws of life, and the ordered and intelligible quality of events in the universe. They look upon these things as objective attestations to the existence of an intelligence who rules over nature. The Holy Quran harshly criticizes the materialists, asking, "Do you imagine the order of this world to be futile?" It proclaims in answer, "We did not create heaven, earth, and all between them in vain." 38:27. Furthermore, God does not set the affairs of the world in motion without their proper causes. Everything rests solidly on God's sunnah, won't, in the world. You will find no change in God's sunnah. 35:43. Everything in nature, man, and history has a known quality and a fixed term. The most important evidences for God's existence offered in the Quran point to the existence of a rational order and intelligence in nature. At this point, we can see how, like a bigoted medieval schoolman or a political blackmailer, Marx sets up the most deviant, vulgarized, and least widely held views of a rival school of thought as straw men to attack and ridicule. The only straightforward analysis that Marx offers concerning the origins of religion is his famous assertion, "Man is the author of religion, not religion the author of man." Even here, he is only repeating Feuerbach. He attempts to again credit for the point by substituting religion for God, and thereby renders it meaningless, or at least obscure. What does it mean? Religion is not the author of man? Has anyone said, religion is the author of man? Marx says later, religion constitutes a form of self-awareness for those who have not yet gained self-mastery, or who have lost themselves again. Religion is, however, a supra-rational realization of human destiny. For human destiny has no real existence. In consequence, to combat religion is to combat a world for which religion is the spiritual essence. The affliction of religion simultaneously expresses actual misery and constitutes a protest against it. Religion is the sigh of a helpless entity, the heart of a heartless world, and the spirit of a dispirited being. It, religion, is the opium of the people. Criticizing religion inevitably leads to criticizing the sea of tears over which religion is the halo. Wherein all this is a thought that does not carry more of literary technique than philosophical depth. If the perspectives that are essentially Feuerbach's are set aside, what remains of Marx but style? At the close of this discussion, when he assumes a more serious and rational tone, he merely repeats in a fuzzy way Feuerbach's theme of combating the alienating effect of religion. Criticizing religion delivers man from error, so he may think, act, and create his own intellect, that he may revolve around himself, that is, around his own true sun. Is this anything other than that self-same atheistic humanism that is the basis of Feuerbach's position? Religion is a supra-rational realization of human destiny. What does this mean? Marx is no doubt referring to the vulgarized and erroneous notions of the religious thinkers who envision the next world as a substitute for this one with all its economic and human shortcomings. But, on the contrary, anyone who has studied the original scriptural sources and the more conscious exponents of a religion has seen that religion regards the next world as simply the logical and intelligible continuation of life in this world. There is nothing supra-rational or contrary to science about it. Heaven and hell, the higher and lower degrees of the afterlife, reflect the respective services or disservices done by each person for his society. They constitute the final outcome of the material and worldly life of an individual or a collectivity, who in this life has either chosen the road of human progress, grown in moral virtues, and imparted them to the people, or else corrupted his own nature and spread corruption about him. We see that to perceive the workings of the universe as unintelligible, supra-rational, or even unscientific is to lose sight of this reflection and this continuity. It is this that confounds humanity in what Marx calls a heartless world and a dispirited existence. Such is life for the man who, in a world of unfeeling matter, has become the plaything of a blind and unending dialectical conflict and is drowning in a sea of tears with his disheartening black halo of atheism. As we look back on this fanatical and unmitigated attack of Marx on religion, we should note his remark: religion is a supra-rational realization of human destiny, for human destiny has no real existence. Of course, Marx wrote this a century ago, before the advent of the 20th century, and more especially, the pessimistic age that followed World War II, so he could not see to what results, what wholesale disasters, his words would lead. Human destiny has no real existence. It is precisely here that we have the fundamental difference between religion and materialism. That today, humanity should rush toward futility, that the young should engage in pointless rebellion, and that philosophy, art, and literature should speak of the meaninglessness of everything, including the meaninglessness of humanity. These are the natural and inevitable consequences of denying a theistic worldview. That is because to deny God and his presence in existence and man renders existence idiotic and man purposeless, so that neither Sartre's existentialism nor an upside-down Hegelian dialectic via Marx can bestow meaning and intelligence upon them. It is not surprising that after the fall of the bourgeoisie and the triumph of communism, Marx's dialectics should cease to be operative in history, and the struggle of thesis and antithesis should culminate in a sort of peaceful coexistence. Marx is powerless to indicate where, beyond communism, human destiny should lead in this world here, not to mention the next. That is a question that neither the ancient materialism nor dialectical materialism can answer, since, as René Guénon said, when the world is without meaning and purpose, man is likewise meaningless, purposeless. Marx grants that such humanity lacks a real destiny. Islam, on the other hand, goes beyond granting humanity an honored place in nature. We have honored the progeny of Adam, 1770. It does more than deny that God has made man a helpless creature who, having lost himself, searches for his own values and powers in God's being and demands them from him with sighs and tears. It holds that God has consigned his trust to humanity. We offered the trust to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, and they refused to bear it, fearing it, and man undertook it. 33:72. It holds that humanity was created as God's deputy in nature. Truly, I am about to place on the earth a vice-regent. 230. Nothing could go further to confute Marx's and Feuerbach's reasoning in deducing man's alienation from himself before God than the saying of Sayyidina Ali, upon whom be peace, which stands as a decisive affirmation of man's nobility and man's responsibility for his own self-perfection and liberation. Your disease is within you, and you know not, and your remedy is within you, and you see not. It appears that Marx's knowledge of religion was confined to what his father, of Jewish descent, Protestant by conversion, had comprehended of it. He had not even heard of one of the most basest doctrines of Judaism, Protestant Christianity, and Islam alike, God's assignation of free will to man, that he might struggle in his earthly life and search for his own liberation. At any rate, when Marx attacks a particular school, rather than base his arguments on its principles of faith and original texts, he reasons from the deviations and superstitions that have overtaken the more degraded and illiterate of its followers, since they make easy targets for ridicule and are readily discredited, and since he thereby frees himself from the need to research further. Marx seeks the easy way out when he attacks religion, although it changes the tone of his discourse from that of a learned philosopher to that of an evangelist preacher or a sophist politician. No matter, since for him the attack on religious faith blazes the trail for the victory of Marxism. And of course, this movement holds that the end justifies the means, even if they include what Lenin terms ruthlessness toward religion. It is not surprising, then, that Marx, a scientific philosopher of dialectics, should, in combating religion scientifically, replace the intellectual and scientific facts concerning religion with the historical and social role of the religious-minded, and that he should, through the simple expedient of attacking the latter, seek the not-so-easy object of annulling the former. And thus he would reason that religion is a means for justifying social injustice. At this juncture, he neither enters into a philosophical discussion or scientific inquiry, as the 17th-century materialists or even the ancient naturalists did, nor even speaks of religion per se or of the original and authentic religious movements. The social principles of Christianity rationalized ancient slavery, endorsed medieval serfdom, and understand how, when the necessity arises, to support the suppression of the proletariat, however regretfully. The social principles of Christianity preach the necessity for the existence of a ruling class and a ruled class. The social principles of Christianity relegate compensation for all atrocities to the next world, while explaining their persistence in this world as punishment for original sin or as a burden God has imposed as a test of his servants. The social principle of Christianity preached dishonor, contemptibility, abjectness, servility, humanity. In short, all base qualities. The proletariat, refusing to accept this debasement, has much greater need of courage, self-respect, pride, and desire for independence than of bread. The social principles of Christianity are hypocritical, but the proletariat is revolutionary. Is this speaker the Karl Marx who supposes morals are the superstructure arising from the economics of production? Is this the Karl Marx who does not distinguish between ideology and organization? Both suppositions are quite difficult to believe. Unfortunately, however, this is the Karl Marx who identifies the Messiah with the Pope, so that all non-Marxist intellectuals and even independent Christian thinkers should join in attacking him, regardless of the weakness of this line of his reasoning. Furthermore, this kind of argument and inference belongs to the vulgar, although unscrupulous propagandists may make use of it for political or quasi-religious ends. It is vulgar to criticize the weakness and corruption of the religious classes and to infer from it that religious studies are futile. To identify the role in society played by the Christian clerical class in the Middle Ages with that of Jesus, the Messiah, in the Palestine of 2,000 years ago is, if not highly tendentious, indicative of utter ignorance. to identify the hundreds of thousands of martyrs among the peoples of Palestine, Ethiopia, and Northern and Western Europe who rose against the expansionist Roman imperialism with the nightmarish apparatus that brought about the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of the world's people, Christian and non-Christian alike, amounts to nothing more than hollow abuse. Could Marx actually not know that independent Christian thinkers, in struggling against the church and the clergy, and against what Marx terms the social principles of Christianity, have made greater sacrifices to greater effect than materialists and Marxists? The 300,000 in Barcelona alone who were massacred by the church were themselves all Christians. In the case of the 100 Years' War, were they not Christians who were being slaughtered by other Christians? And why should Marx, like the priests, seek to impugn Islam by making much of the disgraces of the caliphate? Weren't the first and most outstanding of those martyred by the caliphate likewise the first and most outstanding of those brought up within the Islamic religion? It is not surprising that Marx, in order to attack religion, should assume the very tone of the most fanatical religious propagandists attacking an enemy religion. What is surprising is that, if the text at hand is studied closely, he has assumed the tone proper to religion. Dishonor, contemptibility, abjectness, servility, humanity, in short, all base qualities. The proletariat, refusing to accept this debasement, has much greater need of courage, self-respect, pride, and desire for independence than of bread. What a remarkable thing. We hear those moral values and spiritual virtues that religion has always defended, proclaimed with such fervor by that selfsame Marx, who deems them social mores arising from a particular economic system and productive infrastructure, who calls them all mutable, with nothing sacred about them. How is it that here he holds these spiritual values higher than bread? And not for the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie, or from the standpoint of moral idealism, but for the proletariat. Although we do not wish to deny that atrocities may be attributed to the medieval clergy, for one who is cognizant of morals and their relation to religion, who is aware of the way religion has always placed its heaviest reliance upon moral values and has eulogized them, and who likewise has read Plekhanov's essays on communism and morals, to hear Marx say such a thing is astonishing. Spiritual values higher than bread. Isn't this borrowing the armaments of religion to use in a ruthless attack on religion? Marxism wages war on religion more fiercely than do any other of the materialist schools, although to the same extent that it is the most harsh and fanatical of them. It uses the weakest, most ill-founded, and ambiguous logic for its attacks. All at the same time, Marxism, like the scientists and the materialist idealists of recent centuries, particularly the 17th, regards religion as having arisen due to man's ignorance of the scientific laws of causality. Like the materialist psychologists, as a product of man's psychological weakness and lack of self-awareness and self-mastery. Like the materialist sociologists, as a carryover from pre-technological and pre-industrial systems of production, and also, most naively and superficially, a cunning stratagem of the ruling class to rationalize oppression of the ruled, the people. We see that Marxism makes use of all the anti-religious arguments brought forward to its day from earlier times and adds nothing original to them. This is an important point to recall concerning the relationship of Marxism and religion. It is considered that Marxism, because it is founded upon dialectical materialism, is in basic conflict with religion, the essence of which rests upon worship of the unseen and the divine worldview. If such be the case, the divergence between Marxism and religion will never remain within the confines of a difference of philosophical and scientific viewpoints, as is true of the discrepancy between religion and Hegel's atheistic idealism, Sartre's materialistic existentialism, or say the atheistic humanism of Diderot and Ernest Renan. On the contrary, Marxism assumes such a militantly hostile stance toward religion that as recently as 1961, more than 100 years after the birth of Marx, the text of the official program of the Soviet state and Communist Party reaffirms the protracted and relentless combat against religious faith in order to establish communism among the Soviet people. That it should assume such a harshly bellicose stance against religion stems not only from the discrepant philosophies of materialism and religion, but also from the radical difference deriving from two opposed conceptions of humanity, which give rise in turn to two opposed conceptions of morals, life, economics, culture, education, of man's eschatological and historical destiny, of society and the universe as a whole. We should mention another crucial point here. There are those who imagine that of the various religions, Islam, apart from its opposition to Marxism over the question of God, resemble it in many aspects of its approach to human and social questions. These similarities have been discussed to varying extents by such persons as Michel Aflaq, Omar Uzgan, Bashir Mohammed, Bashir Ali, and in the West by Maxime Rodinson. And it is very interesting that, at the opposite pole, certain colonial politicians, including some who officiated over massacres in colonized Muslim lands in Africa, like General Salan and General Charbonneau in Algeria, have leveled the same accusation against Islam. To begin with, one may find shared elements in any opposing schools of thought, between German fascism and Jewish Zionism, between materialist humanism and sacred mysticism, and in particular between communism and capitalism. Secondly, similarities of ideal are typically confused with ideological similarities. Opposing ideologies may hold shared ideals, civilization, scientific progress, and material prosperity are ideals that a colonized society may struggle to realize. But it must not be forgotten that these amount to the very ideology of the colonialists. That is, they believe that by being colonized by an advanced society, a backward society may achieve civilization, scientific and technological progress, and material well-being. Thus, shared ideals may be found in the two diametrically opposed ideologies of colonialism and the liberation movements. Human ideals transcend ideology, as well as the limits of the social order and the historical period. They arise from what is specifically human. They form the eternal moral values in man: freedom from compulsion, growth toward perfection, justice, truth, human self-awareness, the precedence of society over the individual, a common measure for value and achievement, the banishment of force, of war, of exploitation, of enslavement, ignorance, and weakness, the rightful chance to live and grow, the elimination of class conflict, of racial, familial, or other collective forms of exclusion, and of unfair social, economic, and moral distinctions. All are human ideals that throughout the history of human social life have been the slogans of free and humane people. One might say they constitute the genuine and original basis of humanism in its most general sense. It is from this point on that divergence arise in the various systems of thought, each generating a separate school in the course of interpreting those ideals, and more particularly, the means for their attainment. The religions, through joining humanity to the origin of the world; philosophy, through disclosing the intelligible laws governing life; Western bourgeois liberalism, by individuals' free and competitive efforts in the field of material production, leading to the acquisition of power, to progress, and the development of science; Marxism, by means of state ownership and rule, to a similar outcome; Sufism, through turning to one's self for the sake of growth in spirit, intellectual self-sufficiency, and deliverance of the spirit from the bonds of the natural. Appetites. Naturalism, on the contrary, through accordance with the qualities of nature, and so forth. We must now ask, what methods, what systems do Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Hegelian idealism, Marxist dialectics, and the others offer for achieving these eternal human ideals? The question having been asked, we must say truthfully that contrary to the beliefs of those who look for shared modalities in Islam and the communism of Marx, these, as two comprehensive ideologies, are altogether opposed. As it happens, we must seek to demonstrate this opposition by reference to those same matters in which some persons have seen a similarity. This is due to the fact that the only comparable modality of the two schools is that each is a complete, comprehensive ideology. The other ideologies, for the most part, are partial. That is, they are based primarily on a single field of human activity. For instance, that of materialism and of naturalism is philosophy, while in the fields of politics, economics, morals, sociology, anthropology, and historiography, adherents are given free rein. They may belong to the left or the right. They may consider history methodical and scientific or unmethodical and unscientific. They may account man a being endowed with an essence of a special innate character, or they may regard him as something produced from and shaped by nature, culture, or the means of production. The same may be said of existentialism, to the extent that an existentialist may be a believer or an atheist, socialist or capitalist. Nationalism rests upon the drive for the political independence and cultural integrity of the nation in question. A nationalist may honestly profess idealism or materialism, fascism or democratic ideals, piety or atheism. The same applies to the religions, in that they are based upon man's relationship with the unseen or the sacred. Their rules and ordinances stem from the desire to order this relationship, or from the moral and pedagogical values that safeguard the special life and character of the religion for its adherents. Islam and Marxism, however, are two ideologies that embrace every dimension of human life and thought, which is to say that each possesses a particular cosmology, a particular code of morals, a particular form of social organization, a particular philosophy of history and future outlook, and a particular vision of what man is and particular means of disseminating that vision. Each is keenly interested in the private and social lives of people in this world. But in all of these areas, the two ideologies are diametrically opposed. Islam and Marxism completely contradict each other in their ontologies and cosmologies. Briefly, Marxism is based on materialism and derives its sociology, anthropology, ethics, and philosophy of life from materialism. The Marxist cosmos, i.e. the materialist cosmos, is, as Marx puts it, a heartless and dispirited world where man lacks a real destiny. By contrast, the cosmology of Islam rests upon faith in the unseen ghaib, being definable as the unknown actuality that exists beyond the material and natural phenomena that are accessible to the senses and to our intellectual, scientific, and empirical perception, and which constitutes a higher order of reality and the central focus of all the movements, laws, and phenomena of this world. The Quran, at the beginning of the first surah, Al-Baqarah, proclaims faith in the unseen to be the prerequisite for guidance and the very source of piety. Alam, this is the book in which is no doubt a guide to the pious, who believe in the unseen, bil ghaib, are steadfast in prayer, and spend out of what we have provided for them. 2:1-2. This unseen is in truth the absolute spirit and will of existence. Contrary to idealism, which looks upon the phenomena of the material world as arising from the idea, and in contrast to materialism, which imagines the idea as springing from the material world. Islam regards matter and idea as differing manifestations, ayat, of the unseen absolute being, thus negating both materialism and idealism. It likewise grants the existence of the natural world separate from our idea of it, and also maintains that man, as a being in which the idea subsists, has an independence and a nobility relative to material nature, society, and production. Marx strives, in imitation of Feuerbach and the other new humanists, to free humanity from life as an economic entity and from intellectual and political alienation from itself, tries to restore its unity by banishing divisive specialization, wishes, as he puts it, to return humanity to its human values, innate powers, and self-mastery, and would have it achieve self-awareness and become free of all compulsion. In failing to perceive in his cosmology any factor other than matter and its unseeing, unconscious conflict, he necessarily plunges the humanity he has exalted in his ideology into the pit of insensate matter, and in the final analysis ranks it among natural objects. In fact, Marx suffers from the same contradictions that all materialist thinkers do who attempt to rise to the defense of humanism. Having maintained that there is only one principle of existence, matter, they struggle in vain as humanists to accept a second, humanity. Therefore, from a certain standpoint, when they first speak of unity in relation to being, and then introduce the concept of humanism, they are faced with dualism, since one may not both profess materialism and, by extricating humanity from the world of material things, bestow a primacy and independence upon it. But the idealists who believe in humanism are also involved in troubles. Those who deny the actuality of the external world or negate its validity as it is perceived, granting primacy to the idea with a human intelligence, certainly affirm humanism or the primacy of man. Yet, by denying the actuality of the material world and denying science, the bridge between the idea and the actual, they abandon man as a primary being for a mind taken out of the world of actuality and placed in a melancholy world with absolutely no criterion for distinguishing true from false, knowledge from ignorance, good from evil, real from imaginary. Like the sophists of ancient Greece, they inevitably end up in the lap of a kind of egocentrism. And is humanism nothing more than an egocentrism? So we see that man turns out to be an object in Marxist humanism, and in idealistic humanism, jinn. Islam, however, not only resolves the oppositions of nature, man, and God through the principle of tawhid, but also by proclaiming the truth that human subjectivity and material nature are both different signs or manifestations of a single sublime essence, transcends the oppositions of idea and matter, and of man and nature. Even while considering the essential human reality and material actuality as two distinct principles, it establishes a fundamental bond, an existential relation between them in regarding the two as arising from a single origin. Not only does the notion of religion's alienating effect, which Marx borrowed from Feuerbach and relies so heavily upon, have no applicability to Islam, but the opposite is true. Man's alienation from himself before God is replaced by man's awareness of himself in relation to himself. To demonstrate the point, let us retrace first Feuerbach's and then Marx's reasoning. Then their conclusions will be easily refuted. God is a human fabrication. God is a manifestation of human nature. Man has projected his own essential values and powers onto heaven and undertaken to worship them in the form of a transcendental being called God. In truth, he has attributed to this object of worship what he himself possesses, which exists within him. If we accept this position, then we have refuted the concept of man's alienation from himself, since in this case, God becomes synonymous with man. Theolatry turns out to be anthropolatry, and man's alienation from himself through God is transformed into his alienation from himself through the human. In addition, isn't this human awareness of itself in relation to itself, or human self-awareness, another way of saying humanism? If so, theolatry would characterize a religion in which man, in a material world constantly threatening him with materialism, animal degradations, and moral lapses, would be the devoted worshipper of his own transcendental sacred values. We see that in Marx's most forceful attack upon religion, his logic overturns his own conclusions. As it happens, to conclude that theolatry, in its developed conscious form, neither negates man's primacy nor produces in man alienation from himself, but in fact does bestow primacy on man and sanctity on human values, and expresses an exalted, meaningful, and worthwhile humanism. To do this is to reach a conclusion altogether in accord with Islam. As opposed to the view of the Catholics or the Sufis, who acknowledge an opposition between God and man, i.e., who make man an extinction, fana, in the face of eternity, baqa, and present him as condemned to divine predestination. In Islam, through the principle of assignation, i.e., humanity's assumption of its freedom, discretionary powers, and destiny, man is free of material determination and divine foreordination. We even see Adam in God's paradise rebelling against his command. This free will empowered to choose makes man God's vice-regent in nature. When man has attained this divine rank in nature, despite the materialist's efforts to deify man, as Marx saw it, the materialist worldview is too narrow and petty to envision such a thing. God has all the angels prostrate themselves before him and makes all the powers of nature subject to him. We see that man in the Islamic worldview is a governing will in relation to nature, and might be termed the God of nature. In relation to God, he fulfills the role of his vice-regent. We see how foreign what Marx termed the affliction of religion is to the conceptions that make up the text of the Quran. The most important factor prompting Marx to say, "I loathe God," is the principle of worship and obedience inhering in relation between God and man. In contrast to Marx, however, who infers this principle from its corrupted and vulgarized forms, prevalent among the backward and superstitious, and sees in it a manifestation of man's misery, affliction, and alienation from himself. Islam, in God's works, interprets it as a factor for the growth and perfection of the divine nature in mankind. Obey me, my servant, so that I may make you like me. We see that in the philosophy of Islam, the relation of God and man is one of reciprocity, where self-knowledge and knowledge of God come to be synonymous, or alternatively, where the former functions as a preliminary to the latter. We refer here to the profound remark of the Iranian mystic, Bayazid Bastami. For years I sought God and found myself. Now that I seek myself, I find God. Quite to the contrary of the views of Feuerbach and Marx, it is not humanity that has made God, reposed its proper values in him, and now worship him. It is rather God who has made humanity, reposed his proper values in it, and now praises it. Accordingly, if Marx, instead of speaking of man's alienation from himself vis-à-vis God, had discussed God's alienation from himself vis-à-vis humanity, at least his remarks would have been interesting as a sort of philosophical satire. It may be seen that we are no larger speaking of the contradiction between religion and materialism, or between Islam and dialectical materialism, but rather of the question of humanity. Every ideology, religious or anti-religious, necessarily revolves around the question of the human, and it is in fact at this point that Marxism most diverges from Islam. This ever-increasing divergence is the nature result of the two opposed worldviews from which the two ideologies arise, and which underlie their whole manner of interpreting phenomena. From this point on, Islam and Marxism prove incompatible in all areas of politics, economics, ethics, and social concerns. Islam interprets and evaluates man on the basis of Tawhid, and Marxism does so on the basis of production, Tawhid. Marx is undoubtedly aware that he thus vitiates all the moral values and humanistic qualities of man that he so fervently praised in some of his own writings, since in one swoop he transfers all the values that humanity has created, or at any rate possesses, to the means of production, which makes the primacy of man, in the Marxist's version, a primacy of economic tools. Within the narrow bounds of the impoverished materialist worldview, no element is more honored than that of production. Thus we see that, both in theory and in practice, Marx's communism, while trying to justify itself on the basis of the highest moral values and human ideals, and while presenting itself as the very realization of humanism, quickly degenerates into an economism. If Stalinism, in its obsession with the economy and fanatical drive to increase production, has been accused of plotting a deviationist course, the same could not be said of Lenin. Virtually all the authorities agree that he faithfully pursued and realized a Marxist policy. It is no accident that the first years of the Soviet Revolution see him making heavy industry the cornerstone of the revolution, proclaiming the economic abundance thus to be created as the fundamental condition for realizing the Marxists' ideal society, the ultimate goal of communism, and to this end relying on the following three principles: rapid industrialization, with principal reliance on the establishment of heavy industries; comprehensive planning, with the lives of all members of society to be minutely coordinated by a techno-bureaucratic organization. In this, one must, Lenin himself put it, imitate capitalism. The institution of competition as a means to increased production. This to be through the establishment of a set of models for, and stimuli to, individual and collective effort via the stimulation of self-interest, in the form of unequal wages and rewards, and material and occupational incentives for the technically skilled and the administratively competent. We see that what many writers, including large numbers of communists, have attacked as the Stalinist economy was based on the policies of Lenin. It must be added that Lenin was thus realizing the scheme Marx and Engels had proclaimed as the method for constructing the ideal society. How is it that justice and equality as a principle of social relations becomes, in Marxism, entirely conditional upon elements borrowed from the capitalist system, culture, and Western morals, to wit, 1. Mechanism, 2. Techno-bureaucracy, 3. Acquisitiveness, 4. Economic competition, and 5. The individual profit motive? At last, the ultimate goal comes into sight: the greatest possible degree of material prosperity. The question naturally arises: so what is the fundamental difference in philosophy of life between Marxism and the bourgeoisie? After all, the difference between the two theses, capital will be at the disposal of a single class, and capital will be at the disposal of the state, is the difference between two systems, not that between two philosophies or two different conceptions of life, humanity, moral values, or the universe. Accordingly, if we infer that, from the standpoint of outlook as well, Marxism shares the bourgeois worldview, anthropology, and morals, and that inasmuch as it appeared in a Western bourgeois culture setting, the inevitable product of the infrastructure of its age, it shares the intellectual content, spirit, and object in life of its adversary, the bourgeoisie, have we judged it unfairly? Not at all. As Marx fully accepts, the Western bourgeoisie comprises not merely an economic system, but likewise a particular spirit, outlook, anthropology, philosophy of life, and morality. Through these, in which all spiritual motives are dismissed in favor of the dominion of base material life over all the higher qualities of humanity, it addresses man as a being who will work, deceive, and wage war all the more, in order to eat all the more. Therefore, as Professor Grimbert says, isn't it true that Marxism is trying its utmost to build a totally bourgeois society? That is to say, the difference between Marxism and the Western bourgeoisie lies in the fact that one promotes a bourgeois class, and the other a bourgeois society. Saint-Simon, founder of the religion of industrialism, divides society into two classes. The industrial class, which has a role in production and is composed of workers, engineers, capitalists, and factory workers, artists, and the class of parasites, composed of consumers uninvolved in production, such as intellectuals, writers, artists, clergy, philosophers, heroes, statesmen, athletes, soldiers, and so forth. This outlook, exemplifying the utmost in worship of production, and even placing worker and capitalist in a single class, one disposed against the spiritual and cultural forces of society at that. Despite its apparent opposition to the outlook of Marx from the standpoint of sociology, resembles it in the essence of its philosophy, its approach to man. In communist China, we know, the very small steel blast furnaces set up in the villages have come to be regarded as symbols of the revolution and designated the people's sacred blast furnaces. In the Soviet Union, a major author has written a book entitled The Cult of Cement. Prompted by this mentality, it maintains that responsibility for human civilization, culture, and well-being has been transferred from God, morals, philosophy, science, and so forth, to cement. At this point, it is appropriate to relate the opinion of one of the most outstanding and dedicated Marxist intellectuals of Lenin's and even Engels' time, Edouard Baird. In this work, Les Nouveaux Aspects du Socialisme, in a remarkable phrase, he says quite seriously, Marxism is the philosophy of the producers. If this be true, given actual experience, facts, and figures, American capitalism has every right to claim superiority to Marxism. The central problem, however, appears to remain insoluble. How does this humanism or primacy of man, oft cited and much vaunted by Marx as he does battle with the bourgeoisie, result from the primacy of production? Taking as our starting point the universal human ideals, we see how, the closer we draw to the letter and spirit of Marxism, the farther we are from the spirit of Islam. The two ways diverge. Islam, very simply, is a philosophy of human liberation. Its first summons, say there is no God but God and prosper, propounds Tawhid as the necessary means to that end. We see that from the same beginning, Islamic humanism ascends to a kind of awareness, while Marxist humanism proceeds to a kind of production. Then does Islam lead to a mystical and ascetic idealism foreign to actuality? Has Islam, like the mystical religions and ideologies, forgotten the principle of justice? Not at all. Islam addresses economic welfare and social justice as principles of its social order. Indeed, it stresses them. To be precise, in Islam, these principles constitute essential prerequisites. They can free man from poverty and discrimination, so that, through moral growth and particular evolution, he may freely unfold his inherent divine nature. This is paramount to the philosophy of human life in Islam. Islam and Marxism also differ in their basic criteria for interpreting human moral values or humanism. Here we must point to what is at the same time one of the most glaring and one of the least noted of Marxism's self-contradictions, one that is simultaneously the major factor in its success in attracting minds and hearts, and the major factor in its failure to realize its own proclaimed ideals. For to be brief, Marxism has emerged as a major source of opposition to Marxism. Many intellectuals who have been made painfully aware of this contradiction, without fully resolving or even quite admitting it, have followed the line of least resistance in accounting for it. They have posited an essential difference between Marxism as a school and the existing Marxist regimes, distinguished subjective Marxism from objective Marxism, and regarded the Marxist regimes as having strayed from the principle of Marxism, for which reason those regimes have not achieved the original aims of Marxism as its founders envisioned them. Then these intellectuals have sought to resolve the accusations and curses as revisionism, personality cult, nationalism, embourgeoisement, collaboration, Titoism, Stalinism, Maoism, and so forth. In truth, the contradiction lies in the very sources of the ideology. It is a contradiction between ends and means, the contradiction between man in Marxist philosophy and man in Marxist society. When Marx speaks of man, and in particular when he speaks with fervor and profundity of the infamy of capitalism, bourgeois culture and social organization, and Western industry, and of the waste of human potential in that system, when he rises to the defense of human freedom, he assumes such a mystical tone that one would suppose him a visionary, a Platonist philosopher, a moralist, or even a man of the cloth. In condemning the capitalist system based on private property, workmen's wages, the value of money, the principle of competition, and so forth, Marx relies, or the most part, on the conception that the reality of man as a sublime essence has been defiled and constricted by this system, and that ignoble values have been substituted for human values. Even as Marx discusses his own materialism in relation to humanity, the tone he adopts recalls the moralists. Where he wishes to demonstrate the reasons why materialism must be the basis of communism, he ascribes to materialism attributes that are altogether the province of religion, or at any rate that of moral philosophy. He gives an idealistic cast to Marxist sociology. It does not require a great deal of insight to see that materialism, owing to its views of intrinsic goodness, the equal gifts of intelligence among all people, the sublime capacity for experience, familiarization, and learning, the equal rights of people to pleasure and the like, is necessarily connected to communism and socialism, where, in defense of humanity and praise of the proletariat, he attacks Christianity. He assumes the tone of a Christian and employs words commonly used in works on religious morality or moral idealism. The social principle of Christianity preached dishonor, contemptibility, abjectness, servility, humility, in short, all ignoble qualities. The proletariat, refusing to accept this debasement, has much greater need of courage, self-respect, pride, and the desire for independence than of bread. Is this Marx speaking about the proletariat? Or is it Jean-Jacques Rousseau? Or maybe Ernest Renan or John Stuart Mill? When he speaks of man's alienation from himself, Marx is a spiritual humanist, praising the true, independent, sacred essence of humanity as the original source of virtuous qualities and a transcendental and free nature, nobler than all other creatures. The more the worker devotes himself to his work and the stronger the alien world created by him becomes, the more impoverished he becomes in his individual self, his inner world. This holds equally true of religion. The more humanity gives itself up to God, the less it belongs to itself. Here we see very plainly that Marx, in discussing humanity, accepts an inner world and an outer world, a self and an environment. It is especially interesting that he sees an inverse relation between them. One feels clearly that he is defending here an independent humanism, in his own words, a self-subsisting human nature, in the face of God, society, and nature. As Marx attacks religion, he raises man still higher in spirituality, as if he were a holy being, the Creator himself, while God, meaning the manifestation of all sacred and absolute moral values, is the reflection of man's holy and transcendental essence. In all the works he and Engels have written on the subject of man, they speak of him as a reality replete with virtuous qualities and sublime eternal values. He is free thinking, capable of choice, an independent cause, superior to material causation, in nature, history, and society. He is distinguished by a sense of honor, by courage, creativity, philanthropy, a readiness to sacrifice himself for his beliefs, and a sense of responsibility toward others. Finally, he is the maker of his own destiny and intrinsic nature, and even prophet and savior to his own people. This is Marx the philosopher speaking about man, Marx who has constructed his humanism from elements derived directly or indirectly from religion, mysticism, moral philosophy, and particularly from 17th century humanism and early 19th century German moral socialism. Thus, André Pietre, among many, has spoken in all seriousness of a mystic or spiritual man in this humanism of Marx's. This is no exaggeration. One may succinctly describe this man Marx is eulogizing as a two-legged god roaming the earth. However, as soon as Marx the philosopher falls silent, Marx the sociologist undoes all he has accomplished. He takes this being who was seated on the divine throne and hurls him headlong to the ground. This mighty creator who has created God, history, and even himself, and who has transformed nature to conform to his self-aware and dominating will, suddenly turns out to have been created by his own economic tools, themselves the inevitable product of the law of dialectical materialism. Those tools fabricate two things: goods and man. Swiftly, Marx the sociologist transforms the nature of the man become God of Marx the philosopher into one befitting man become goods. He speaks of the human constitution in terms that would have enraged or at least alarmed his alter ego. For socialist man, everything in all of human history except the natural human form is the product of work. Engels, in his essay, The Role of Work in Humanizing the Ape, adds, "Economists call work the origin of all wealth, but work is infinitely more than that. Work is the essential condition for all human life, such that, from one point of view, work has created man himself. In truth, work has turned ape into man. The kind of tools with which man works determines the mode of work, which is the infrastructure, in accordance with the character of which the social system, the kind of ownership, the legal system, government, religion, philosophy, literature, arts, moral values, ideology, and culture take shape. The shape they take always being conformable to that infrastructure, or rather being its product. Then we should ask, is humanity anything other than the aggregate of those ideological, cultural, and moral values which in turn are the superstructure and the product of the mode of work? Most importantly, and most frighteningly, sociological Marxism propounds the concepts of capitalism, exploitation, class contradictions, and private and social ownership in a manner fundamentally different from that of philosophical Marxism. In the view of Marx, the sociologist, capitalism is under no circumstances to be condemned as inhuman, but only as being impossible today. Please consider closely the following remarks and note the roles played by humanity, thought, responsibility, moral values, and in particular, the high value accorded such ideals as justice, the elimination of slavery, and the realization of socialism. Human beings, in the social production of their lives, enter a necessary and predetermined stage which is independent of their will. These production relationships are in accordance with a specific degree of development and deployment of the forces of material production. The aggregate of these relationships constitutes the economic structure of a society, that is the actual foundation upon which is constructed a legal and political superstructure, conforming to specific forms of social consciousness. In material life, the mode of production determines the flow of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not human consciousness that determines human existence. On the contrary, it is man's social existence that determines his consciousness. Social relations generally are connected with the forces of production. The handmill exemplifies feudal society, and the steam engine exemplifies the society of industrial capitalism. So it is that the means of production, the handmill, spinning wheel, shovel, hammer and anvil, steam engine, or huge assemblages of industrial machinery, inevitably gives shape to the mode of production, which in turn generates the social superstructure. That is, the infrastructure through economic necessity creates certain legal, social, moral, and cultural forms and certain class relations. Part of this superstructure is ownership. In earlier times, when the mode of production was manual labor and individual, it accorded with a superstructure of private ownership. The machine, however, transformed the mode of production, making it collective. Accordingly, the infrastructure became collective, while the superstructure continued to be one of individual ownership and thus in contradiction with it. That is why industrial capitalism is confronted with contradiction between the productive infrastructure, which has become collective, and the superstructure of ownership, which attempts to preserve the order of the individual. This lack of homogeneity necessarily culminates in revolution, in that the productive infrastructure seeks a superstructure in conformity with itself, collective ownership. Socialism is nothing other than the realization of a superstructure that is congruent with the infrastructure of mechanism. Is it not possible to deduce from this precise analysis a justification for all the social systems, class relations, religious and ethical norms and tendencies, and judicial and legal forms of the pre-industrial age? As the texts of Marxism make clear, in the dialectical materialist theory of history, even the causes of slavery may be deduced from this rule. Slavery, too, is the particular social superstructure of the agricultural mode of production. That is, as primitive communal society changed its mode of production from hunting to agriculture, there arose a need or recruitment of animals, domestication, and the recruitment of human beings, slavery, to come into practice. Accordingly, in every social order and every historical period, the existing conditions have taken the specific form appropriate to the mode of production, that mode itself being determined by the form of the existing tools. In this Marxist sociology and philosophy of history, we see the fearful grave that Marx, the sociologist and economist, has dug for the man become God, created by Marx, the philosopher and anthropologist. Now we are in a better position to understand that remark of Edouard Berthe, the well-known Marxist, that Marxism essentially is the philosophy of the producer. Given a logic that analyzes human history, society, life, culture, thought, and ideals in this manner, what does it mean to say that the capitalist order leads to the corruption of morals and values, of humanism and the essence of man? For as long as Marx does his best in his analysis of society and history to keep his sociology faithful to the barren scientific outlook and the cramped consensus of existing realities, assuming that he has done so, which is highly questionable, How can this words be other than empty when he speaks of truth, value, oppression and justice, freedom or slavery, during the ages of manual labor and agriculture? On the basis of this outlook, we not only would have to call all the sociologists before Marx utopians, but also would have to say that all those who have fought for justice, the saviors and leaders, the masses who struggled against slavery, feudalism, exploitation, the oppressive systems of private property, and even against superstitious and stagnant religions, cultures, and customs, essentially struggled in vain. For because they were unaware of the determining character of the mode of production in their time, they were daydreaming and became utopians. Had they only been versed in the materialist philosophy of history and in scientific socialism, of course they would have accepted the social contexts and legal norms of their times as well. As private ownership and its style of interpersonal relations, however inhuman, because those relations conformed to the economic infrastructure, they would have waited patiently for the appearance of the promised Messiah, the machine, which would collectivize labor. Then, through a dialectical miracle, the paradise promised by the religions would be realized within industrial capitalist society, and man would live there as a contented God. But what values would this contented machine-made God hold? What moral virtues? How would he remedy the corrupt morals engendered by the bourgeois order? And what is the meaning of corrupt morals, given that every morality is part of a superstructure over something determined by the mode of production? What moral criteria exist? Indeed, Lenin, the practical exponent and architect of Marxism, who actually experienced the concrete reality of Marxism at closer hand than Marx himself, discarded the mystical humanism Marx had counterpoised to bourgeois reality and officially proclaimed, "For us, moral principles have no existence apart from society. Such principles are lies on religion." It is clear why Islam views this low and cold-hearted representation of man, morals, and history with such loathing. Why should Marxism acknowledge a set of divine values for man and quickly move to deprive him of them? Why should it, in its philosophy of history, call this God unto himself a boulder standing in the way of the coursing river of dialectical materialism, and in its sociology, consider him a piece of merchandise to be altered through the means of production, and then finally, in an actual socialist order, treat him like a component installed in a totally organized and programmed social structure? Such a drastic decline within the Marxist order is an unavoidable fate for Marxist man. That is because the moral values and nobility of human nature that Marx ascribes to humanity have no logical and scientific basis. He must of necessity seek their origin in one of two sources. He may look to physical nature, there to come up against the naturalism of his day, where man is a static being among animals and objects, but he disavows this position heatedly. He may see man's origins in matter. He may stoop to the materialism prevalent in his own time, what he terms vulgar materialism, and embrace the vision of a clockwork universe, but this too he refutes. Marx and later Engels proclaim, in an effort to free humanity from the anti-human constraints of base naturalism and vulgar materialism, that with the discovery of dialectics and its adjunction to materialism, they avoid all the unfortunate consequences of materialism. Because dialectics considers humanity neither a material object nor a natural being, static and lifeless, but a reality in the process of becoming, by means of its own efforts and through a process of contradiction and conflict. If Hegel maintains such a superiority for his dialectic, his words merit consideration because he regards man as the ultimate synthesis of the absolute idea of being and its antithesis, the material world. Accordingly, in relation to nature and matter, man in Hegelianism is a first cause and noble element. But Marx has, in his own words, overturned this principle. By giving matter precedence over idea, pronouncing idea a thing proceeding inexorably toward man from the heart of matter, he denies man as an aware, thinking, and willing self. Concerning what he has done to the Hegelian dialectic and humanism, he explains, since Hegel's man walked on his head, this overturning enables him to stand now and walk on his 2 feet. To which a Muslim writer has retorted, isn't man really a being who walks on his head? Marx invokes the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who says, one cannot enter the same river more than once, which is to say, everything is in flux, in support of his dialectical materialism. But if Marx has overturned the Hegelian dialectic, he has altogether undone of Heraclitus. The Greek philosopher, although considering everything as undergoing transformation, clearly propounds the existence of 2 constant principles, a sublime substance which he terms fire, and a constant logical order, which he calls logos. This dialectics has no resemblance whatever to Marx's completely materialistic dialectics, in which, as Lenin says, the only principle of existence is change. On the contrary, it is closely allied with the mystical conception of opposites in the Eastern religions, especially as it is found in Zoroastrianism, Manichaeanism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Sufism. That is because, in this conception, although man and the universe are grounded in the strife of opposites, good and evil, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, light and darkness, man and Iblis, 2 constant principles likewise exist. 1, the movement of the cosmos toward perfection, and the other, the sacred essence or eternal spirit that rules over the cosmos. Marx, however, having denied the existence of these 2 principles and accepting only absolute mutability based on contradiction, is of course unable to maintain a position that turns on humanism or eternal human moral values, since nothing that can be relied upon exists in this passing river. Thus, it is only natural that those concepts of human nature and moral values that Marx employed in defending humanism emerge in the context of Marxist society as mutable, capricious material attributes that appear and disappear in accordance with the exigencies of a given system of production, and that no principle should remain. As Lenin says, all moral principles are lies. Islam, on the other hand, in maintaining that the divine element in humanity, as opposed to the principle of Iblis, originates in something superior to material nature, matter, the productive infrastructure of society, and so forth, is able to speak of constant and primal moral values, of a good, indeed holy primordial nature, and of the progressive and creative qualities of mankind. Marx says goodness is innate in man, but in the first place, what is goodness in a materialistic cosmos? And in the second place, in this sweeping flow in which all is subject to transformation, to speak of an unchanging disposition is altogether anti-dialectical. Islam, while speaking of all things, in accordance with the scientific experience of nature, as loci of generation and decay, believes there is an aspect of being that is constant and evolutionary, so that whatever is aligned with it remains in the universe eternally. Everything is perishing except that which is oriented toward Him. 2888. Islam makes not a single unscientific or unrealistic assessment of humanity. It views it as arising from dust, matter, but maintains that it bears an aptitude not of dust, designated as the primordial nature, which is a reflection of the absolute universal will, that is, of God. This is the primordial nature of mankind in which God has created it. 3040. Thus, humanity is a twofold essence, intermediate between nature and God, pursuing its evolutionary movement from dust to God according to its own choice. It is in this context that the terms responsibility and innate goodness may be applied to it. It is also in this context that one may speak of a true and logical humanism, a humanism that neither falls into the pit of materialism nor becomes a toy in an unconscious, involuntary game of dialectics. It likewise does not assume the form of a metaphysical abstraction cut off from reality, nature, and society. It is in this way that Islam, in contrast with Marxism, is in a position to defend the principles termed justice, nobility, guidance, awareness, responsibility, moral values, and human virtues, which are known to every system throughout human history. And it is for this reason that Islam does not have to wait for the appearance of a steam engine to realize them. The ideologies, ancient and modern, that today summon people to themselves fall in general into the categories of mystical religions, Christianity and the Eastern religions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, materialism in its various forms, Western liberalism, nihilism, existentialism, and Marxism. Other than Marxism, all of them, religious or not, are partial, one-dimensional ideologies, and it is only Islam that is able to confront each within its particular dimension. Islam has a purely religious confrontation with Christianity and the Eastern mystical religions, a philosophical opposition to materialism, and an anthropological, and hence moral, dispute with existentialism. It collides with liberalism over social and economic issues. There would be no point in trying to relate it to nihilism abandons everything. Of them all, only Marxism has constructed a complete, multifaceted ideology, and Islam, as a religion and as a people, Ummah, conflicts with it in every dimension. Marxism, among all the new ideologies, is unique in that it struggles to base every aspect of human life, material and spiritual, philosophical and practical, individual and social, upon its peculiar materialistic worldview. It is for this reason that the system afflicts every dimension of human life with the calamity of materialism. Islam, alone among all the historical religions, has this same comprehensiveness. It does not confine itself to ordering the relations between man and God, or to the purification of the soul, as do Christianity and Buddhism. It presents itself as a school comprehending the various aspects of human life, ranging from philosophic outlook to individual daily life. Thus, these two schools stand before men and invite them to one of two opposed intellectual bases and worldviews. Neither of the two is susceptible to division. In the first place, all the elements and dimensions of each have coalesced along the lines of its distinctive world outlook, diametrically opposed to the other. To add any element or dimension to either, or to take one away, could only result in the collapse of the whole structure. Secondly, an ideology is an interrelated whole with a single spirit and essence, and a unique raison d'être. To try to resolve it into its constituent elements would be like killing it and then dissecting the corpse. That is why these two ideologies, as two fully developed systems, stand opposed in every respect. And that is why, as Henry Martinet concluded, Marxism, in spite of the favorable political and economic conditions that have cropped up at various times in the last 100 years, has achieved success in none of the Islamic societies, in contrast with the Far East and Latin America. One must look for the cause solely in Islam. Why? Because unlike Christianity and Buddhism, Islam resists Marxism not in the philosophical dimension alone, but in every dimension and aspect, because it has its own claims in them. Since Marxism is founded on materialism and considers man's essential origin to be dust, its humanism ends up reducing man to the status of an object. Since Islam bases its divine humanism on Tawhid, on the scientific level, it defines man as of the earth, while on the level of existential analysis, it raises him from dust toward God and absolute transcendental values. Since Marxism accounts human values as relative phenomena relating to the societal superstructure, based on the mode of production, it lets them all lapse to the level of material expediency. Since it accounts values to be the emanations of divine attributes in the human sphere, Islam, although it holds economics to be a genuine concern, is able to superimpose on it this system of values and to distinguish principle from ideal. Since it holds that man reflects the existential dualism of dust, God, it is in a position to account for the dualism of profit and value or economy and morals in human life, without having to deny one for the sake of the other, as do the mystical religious and Marxism. Marxism, by conjoining the Hegelian dialectic and materialism, and also by introducing the concept of the tools of material production, arrives at a materialistic determinism bound up with the same tools of production, which completely undermines the conception of man as will and consequently leaves the principle of human responsibility without justification. Islam grants that society possesses ordering principles and that the continuous evolutionary movement of human history is based upon scientific laws. But because it considers the human will to be a manifestation of the universal will of being and not an unwitting product of the exigencies of production or of society, Islam never hurls it into the terrible pit of materialistic determinism. Likewise, by proclaiming the principle of assignation or descent, Hobat, it frees mankind from the bond of divine determinism in which the Eastern religions are caught. Marxism, when it wishes to deny religion, calls God an outward manifestation of the human essence, setting man in God's place in the universe. But when it wishes to demonstrate historical materialism, it makes this man, the creator of God, the product of the tools of production. Islam situates humanity in a world of Tawhid, where God, man, and nature display a meaningful and purposeful harmony. It presents Adam as the principal essence of the species humanity, as dust into which God has breathed his spirit, as intermediate between spirit and matter. Further, it places the divine trust exclusively in his hands. In this way, it presents a basis beyond that of matter for the principle of human responsibility. Through the parable of Eve and Iblis, with its concept of rebellion, Islam situates the principle of eros and logos in man's essence, and formalizes the independence of the human will from divine predestination. Through the principle of descent, from heaven to earth, it dispatches him into earthly life, so that he may realize heaven through his will, love, awareness, and responsibility, amid contradiction and suffering, and so that he may forge ultimate destiny with his own two hands. The resurrection is the day on which man will see what his two hands have sent forwards. 73:40. Since worship, when conscious and heartfelt, becomes a manifestation of all absolute sacred values, the worshipper nourishes these values in a relative human mode in his own being. Thus he sustains his essential being in a state of sincerity, refines his feelings, grows steadfast in his pursuit of essential perfection, and gains a sense of detachment from dust, objective material existence. By basing his existence upon Tawhid, as a worldview and a moral philosophy, and likewise as both a way of life and life's essential and ultimate meaning, he achieves deliverances. The opposing ways in which Islam and Marxism approach humanity may be summed up in several pairs of examples. First, Marxism, because it is founded on an absolutely materialistic worldview, is incapable of raising humanity in its essence, attributes, or evolutionary state beyond the narrow confines of materiality. It necessarily ranks it along with all other beings in the confines of an unconscious and purposeless nature. Islam, in holding to the worldview of Tawhid, is able to justify man as a divine essence, grant him transcendental attributes, extend his evolution to the infinite, and thus situate humanity in a living, meaningful, and infinite universe whose dimensions extend far beyond what even the sciences can represent. 2. Marxism, in accepting only the conception of matter of classical physics, is forced through materialistic analysis to retract all it has said about the essential glory and noble primacy of humanity. Thus, the glorious being envisioned by Marx, the philosopher and humanist, the creator of God, is suddenly reduced to a piece of merchandise, a product of the tools employed in crafts, agriculture, or industry. Islam, in explaining the world of matter and the primordial nature of man as two signs of one exalted being and absolute consciousness, is able simultaneously to accept the existence of a reciprocal impact of man upon environment and environment upon man, and also, insofar as man acts as a cause in the chain of causality, to uphold the human station without reference to natural and social determination. It guards humanity from slipping into the pit of materialist, historicist, or sociologist fanaticism, so that the primacy of man will not be transformed into a primacy of matter or of tools. 3. Marxism, remaining fiercely loyal to materialist realism, relinquishes its right to speak of values or to make judgments on the basis of them. Islam, maintaining a belief in an absolute source for values beyond the empirical realm, can justify them logically. 4th Marxism, because it considers man to be the product of his social environment, which in turn is an aggregate of shifting structure and circumstance, is unable to base itself on a constant principle such as the human essence or human reality. Having denied both God and the primordial nature of man, it has relinquished the authentic basis for the human values that make up the body of morals. Consequently, as Lenin puts it, all talk of moral principles is a lie. Just as Islam maintains the existence of constant principles in nature upon which science is based, it asserts that constant principles exist in our primordial nature and form the basis of morals. According to Islam, human values are just as authentic and demonstrable as natural laws. Contrary to Marxism, which tries to equate those values with social customs and to bury them in the depths of an economic and social materialism, Islam is totally committed to freeing them from the mutable yet coercive conditions and exigencies of material life, by rooting them in the primordial nature of man and showing them to be reflections of the absolute shining upon the human conscience. 5. Marxism, by annexing dialectical to materialism in order to arrive at an explanation for historical and social change, has arrived at a materialistic determinism in which man has given up his primacy and become the plaything of this blind process of contradiction. Consequently, it denies whatever it has claimed by way of humanism and completely deprives humanity of all freedom and responsibility. Islam, seeing this element of contradiction in the human constitution, does not deny freedom, choice, or its consequence, responsibility, but sees them as issuing from precisely this contradiction. It defines man as a being in contradiction, having the dual essence of clay and divine spirit, and as a will that can choose either one over the other. His human responsibility urges him to place his earthly half at the service of his divine half for the sake of its growth, and thus to achieve existential clarity and purity of spirit. In this way, he may transmute his existential dichotomy to Tawhid and assume divine characteristics. We see that through the annexation of Marxist dialectics to materialism, a materialistic determinism is produced that logically denies human choice, and its consequence, human responsibility. Human choice is seen as arising from dialectics, while responsibility arises from choice. Sixth, Marxism has overturned the Hegelian dialectic, changing it from one based on idealism to one based on realism. But this has ruined the dialectics of Heraclitus, since Heraclitus, although he envisions everything as in perpetual movement and change, maintains two constant principles alongside this change. One, fire, and the other, logos. This shows that the true outlook of dialectics, as opposed to the one popularized by Marx, has been a mystical one from the start. Substantiating this fact are Western philosophies from that of Heraclitus in ancient Greece to that of Hegel in the 19th century, as well as the worldviews of all the great Eastern religions: Zoroastrianism, the Taoism of Lao Tzu, Manichaeanism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All these explain the world according to the principle of contradiction and change, i.e., generation and decay. Heraclitus exemplifies a typically mystical worldview in his use of fire to symbolize the sacred and eternal substance, and logos to symbolize the constant order and harmony of a universe in total transformation. Marxism, by denying these two constant principles in dialectics, has denied any constant aspect or eternal order in the universe or in humanity. Thus, its humanism is expressed not as a flow, but as a succession of waves, amidst which there is nothing to cling to. 7. In the words of Birth, Marxism is the philosophy of the producers. In the language of the Quran, Islam is the philosophy of guidance. 8. Marxism supposes that man has created God. Man, whom it has thus raised to the empyrean, finds there no throne to occupy. The tether of an overturned and defective dialectics inevitably drags him immediately to the ground, where he is handed over to the tools of production and the mode of production, and condemned to suffer a historical determinism. Islam regards man as having a non-material nature. Maintaining that God has created man, it renders him independent of natural and material determinations. In speaking of man's fateful rebellion in paradise, it presents him as a will independent from that of his Creator, thus freeing him from the ties of divine predestination. In this way, by presenting man as an aware being possessed of a will and freed from the captivity of heaven and earth alike, it arrives at true humanism. Then it has man accorded the unique trust that all the world had balked at but man accepted, which causes all the angels, symbolizing all the forces of the universe, to prostrate themselves at his feet. Finally, Islam looks upon him as God's vice-regent in nature and has him sent forth into this world, so that, like some nature god, he may subjugate the world and build his own destiny through self-awareness, amid contradiction and suffering. Thus he may return to God self-aware. We see how very far such a philosophy's approach to humanity and humanism is from that of the philosophy of the producers. The great contemporary student of Islam, Iqbal, has had the last word on this point. Islam and communism both talk about man and summon man to themselves, but communism has taken pains to draw man from God to dust, while Islam, on the contrary, is striving to raise him up from the dust to God. We see clearly that Islam and Marxism are moving in opposite directions on the road of humanism, with the consequence that either one may be affirmed only by denying the other. Those persons in particular who see Islam as the only path leading through the modern calamities to true deliverance for humanity should carefully consider the words of André Pietre. the contemporary student of Marxism, as he uncovers its true face. Marx's school of thought is in truth indivisible. It presents itself as an all-embracing perspective on man and the universe. Such is its alphabet. Thus, this school takes precisely the place of the religions and wars against them fiercely. One might conclude the same for Islam in relation to all of the ideologies that address man and the universe. Now our conclusion is coming into view. Humanism, which all post-Renaissance humanitarian intellectuals hoped would take over the task of human liberation from religion, has become a sacred article of faith for all the atheistic schools of recent centuries. However, it loses its sacrosanct aura as soon as it is subjected to logical scrutiny and proves an idle speculation, which, like some literary expression, bespeaks utopian values or Platonic wisdoms that are sublime and beautiful, but have no application in the real world. True humanism is a collection of the divine values in man that constitute his morals and religious cultural heritage. Modern ideologies, in denying religion, are unable to account for these values. Consequently, although calling themselves staunchly realist, they become more idealistic than Plato, even as they entangle humanity still further in their fanatical materialism. Poor man, always searching for deliverance and finding only disaster. In his flight from the oppression of the powerful and the slave masters, he turned to the great religions and followed the prophets, and so endured struggle and martyrdoms only to be captured by the Magi, caliphs, Brahmins, and, most terrible of all, the dark and deadly tumult of the medieval church, in the midst of which the Pope, as representative of the celestial God, ruled the earth like some imperious Jehovah, holding the reins of politics, property, and faith, and making servants of intellect and science. Generations struggled and sacrificed to bring about a renaissance, to mobilize humanity to pursue science and liberation, so that it might be freed from what had been inflicted upon it in the name of religion. Humanity arrived at liberalism and took democracy in place of theocracy as its key to liberation. It was snared by a crude capitalism, in which democracy proved as much a delusion as theocracy. Liberalism proved an arena in which the only freedom was for horsemen, vying with one another in raids and plundering. Again, humanity became the hapless victim sacrificed to the unchecked powers that brought science, technique, and everyday life into orbit around their maddening and continually growing greed and search for profits. The desire for equality, for liberation from this dizzying whirl of personal avarice, so horrifyingly accelerated by the machine, led humanity into a revolt that resulted in communism. This communism, however, simply represents the same fanatical and frightening power as the medieval church, only without God. It has its popes, but they rule not in the name of the Lord, but in the name of the proletariat. These absolute despots and sole proprietors also claim quasi-prophetic and spiritual honors and pontificate on matters of science, belief, morals, art, and literature. As the communist system, in the name of justice, comes to dominate those peoples who have fled the oppression and exploitation of Western capitalism, the sentiment of an old, freedom-loving Muslim poet is echoed. Oh, would that the oppression of the sons of Marwan were returned to us, and the justice of the sons of Abbas consumed in the flames. But the spirit never dies. I am referring to the spirit that the Quran speaks of, not the individual soul, but the divine life-giving and animating power that, like Seraphil's trumpet, humanity between Marxism and religion, sounds over the skeletal forms of the ages so that they rise up from those deathly silent graves dug for the human spirit, which so longs for deliverance. Then a fresh ferment, a new resurrection begins, and humanity faces life anew in a new age. Now that this spirit has been breathed into the corpse of this century, during which mankind reached an existential dead end, this humanity which has suffered so greatly in its search for liberation, having undergone bitter experiences with Western capitalism and struck its head against the blank wall of communism, seeks a third road which it is the mission of the Third World to set out upon. What makes this future stand out in greater and more promising relief is the fact that in the capitalist and Marxist worlds alike, powerful spirits have come to self-awareness and raised their heads above the tumult and din of capitalist mechanism to decry the disastrous deformation of a humanity that, trapped in an aimless liberalism with a fake veneer of democracy, is becoming one-dimensional, impoverished, and alienated from itself, and is losing its human identity. Here, in the very teeth of the forces that have all the dimensions of society in their grasp, this spirit has called out. Its call reaches the ears of the age across the high and massive walls that have been thrown up around it, reaching further and penetrating deeper, say by say. It is still too soon to depict the future that is in the making, but we may foresee its general direction. What all the new appeals have in common is beliefs that both the roads onto which Western capitalism and communism have driven humanity culminate in a human disaster, that the way to human liberation therefore consists in turning away from both of them. Apart from this shared negative view, however, one may discern a positive one in all those appeals and searches, a quest for the spirit. We might be too optimistic if we were to interpret all this as a turning to religion, but we may speak with assurance of an aspiring spiritual tendency. There is implicit and even explicit in the words of most of the intellectuals who decry the human disaster taking place in both these, outwardly, conflicting worlds, a revulsion against the materialism of today's philosophy and morals, against the distortion of the true essence of man and the loss of transcendental human values. One mourns the loss of that Ahuran sun that shone out from the depths of human nature, clarifying man's existence, illuminating his life, infusing spirit into the natural world, and creating love and values. Today, in philosophy, Heidegger does not speak in the terms of Hegel or Feuerbach. In science, Max Planck, the outstanding exponent of the new physics, opposed the ideas of Claude Bernard. Heidegger is searching for Christ in humanity, and Planck is searching for God in the world of physics. Modern literature and art, expressing alarm at the futility of modern life, review the deformation of modern man and the dark and deadly loneliness that has enveloped him. Eliot, Strindberg, Guénon, Pasternak, Toynbee, Erich Fromm, Senghor, Uzgan, and Omar Maulud all are in some way searching for light. Even a well-known contemporary physiologist, Alexis Carrel, winner of 2 Nobel Prizes for his work in grafting blood vessels and in preserving living tissues outside the body, speak unself-consciously about grace as a powerful factor in the moral and psychological development and harmonious growth of a person. It even appears that a sort of messianic spirit has sprung up in the closed fortress of the communist world, and human renaissance is taking place. This is occurring despite intensified state opposition to religion, zealous efforts by the ruling party to pacify the new generation of artists and intellectuals, and bring them into line with dialectical materialist dogma and the intimidating exercises of the apparatus of thought control to suppress reactionary ideas, bourgeois tendencies, and religious activity. Today, in contrast to Marx, who felt human liberation depended upon the denial of God, and Nietzsche, who boasted, "God is dead," even an atheistic philosopher like Sartre speaks of God's absence from the universe with painful regret, seeing in this a source of the futility of man and existence, the loss of values. 30 years ago, Iqbal proclaimed, Today, more than anything else, humanity needs a spiritual interpretation of the universe. Although it is implicit in Iqbal words, we might add, it needs a spiritual interpretation of humanity as well. We are clearly standing on the frontier between two eras, one where both Western civilization and communist ideology have failed to liberate humanity, drawing it instead into disaster and causing the new spirit to recoil in disillusionment, and one where humanity in search of deliverance will try a new road and take a new direction, and will liberate its essential nature. Over this dark and dispirited world, it will set a holy lamp like a new sun. By its light, the man alienated from himself will perceive anew his primordial nature, rediscover himself, and see clearly the path of salvation. Islam will play a major role in this new life and movement. In the first place, with its pure tawhid, it offers a profound spiritual interpretation of the universe, one that is as noble and idealistic as it is logical, intelligible. In the second place, through the philosophy of the creation of Adam, Islam reveals in its humanism the conception of a free, independent, noble essence, but one that is as fully attuned to earthly reality as it is divine and idealistic. This is especially true from this standpoint. Islam does not content itself with answering only one philosophical or spiritual need, or with presenting only one ethical viewpoint. It strives to realize the worldview of tawhid and of human primacy within real life. Unlike the subjectivist philosophies and mystical religions, it does not accept in human existence the dichotomies of sacred and profane, belief and behavior, idea and actuality. Thus, Louis Gardet says, Islam is both a religion and a nation. This future, which begins with the discarding of capitalism and Marxism, is neither predestined nor prefabricated. Instead, it remains to be built. There is no doubt that Islam will have an appropriate role in its construction when it has freed itself from the effects of centuries of stagnation, superstition, and contamination, and is put forth as a living ideology. That is the task of the true intellectuals of Islam. Only in this way Islam, after a renaissance of belief and an emergence from isolation and reaction, be able to take part in the current war of beliefs and, in particular, to command the center and serve as an example to contemporary thought, where the new human spirit is seeking the means to begin a new world and a new humanity. This is no extravagant proposal. It is a duty. Not only does the essential summons of Islam require it, but the text of the Quran explicitly enjoins it upon the true followers of Islam. Gods are the East and the West, and thus we have made you a middle people, that you might be witness to the people, and the Prophet a witness to you. 2:143. We see that the scope of Islam's confrontation and opposition to other ideologies, especially those that are concerned with the question of man, is as far-reaching as the very range and depth of its summons.